Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Autistic Tidbits and Tangents podcast. We are talking about finding immunity today. I'm Maya Todale. I'm an autistic psychologist from Denmark, and this is my co-host.
Kara Diamond. I'm an autistic teacher and university lecturer from Toronto, Canada.
And today we're joined by Karen Timm to talk about finding immunity. Karen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate you inviting me on. So I'm Karen Timm. I have a number of hats that we wear, as many of us do. I am an educator with, over 25 years experience in the province of Ontario, as Kara is. I'm also an educational leader who's been in a role of a school administrator, vice principal for, about 15 plus years. I am also, I consider myself now truly a global autistic advocate and, just a really passionate agent of change when it comes to education and utilizing education as a conduit for social change. But I always say at the end of my emails, most importantly, mom. So I'm a proud parent of a multiply neurodivergent young human as well. And happy to be here. Really important topic, finding community for the autistic community and otherwise neurodivergent folks.
Yeah.
And when I think about it too, like one of the reasons that I pursued diagnosis was finding community, was finding people who I felt really understood me and saw me and shared experiences that I had had and was like keeping to myself and not really talking about. Like without community, I think we suffer a great deal more as neurodivergent folks.
Definitely. So let's roll the intro. Welcome to Autistic Tidbits and Tangents.
Candid conversations between autistic off-hour professionals.
Cool. Trigger warnings for this episode include, of course, discussions of ableism, but primarily the ABA method, which we briefly discuss. Finding community obviously is a huge deal, not least in part because social interactions can be so difficult for autistic people. And so from very early childhood, making friends and finding that sense of community can really be a challenge for us. You talked about how you worked a lot in education. So I think actually I would start asking you about what do you think we should be doing in schools to help build that sense of community where autistics are included?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's no one easy answer. And obviously our minds are constantly wrapping our heads around what are the next best moves in education, right? And then the pandemic threw like the most gigantic curveball at all of us on planet Earth. So I think there's lots of layers to that question, and you could like literally spend, an entire week podcast worth just talking about possibilities. But I think the biggest piece is something that we talk about a lot in the advocacy community. The importance of providing opportunities for those who are in positions of power and privilege in terms of change makers, decision makers, politicians, every stakeholder in education who's making decisions needs to be brought up to speed on, current research, the real authentic autistic ways of being that are not that are based on our truths, that are based on a growing global repertoire from people all around the world, to diversify and broaden the narrative. Because for so long, every layer of education, and of course that ties into medical, the medical profession, society, parenting, what's normal, right? All of those things are what direct practice in education. What determines practice has been based on medical model. It's been based on these ideas of, we want everybody to, be productive and to fit in and to interact, communicate. But those things are all based on non-autistic ways of being.
Yeah.
And so the key to that is learning from, listening to, learning with autistics as we're all also on this journey, because every day there's new work, there's new narratives, there's new collaborations, there's new research coming out. So we're in a really time, but it's also very daunting because we have this monumental task, and all the time the clock is ticking. There are little autistics everywhere who don't go into schools, don't go into homes, even when they're brought home from hospitals or wherever they're born. All of the steeped in tradition understanding, very outdated. So we've got to really shift things so that all systems in society are learning from autistics and understanding us from our perspectives.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a really important point in like taking a step from the research and hearing autistic voices in that.
Which is the research. Like that should be the research.
Exactly. And the research is changing, I feel. I certainly see more research being done that includes autistic voices or even has autistic authors. And I'm so excited to see that. But that also brings up the next problem, which is how do we help people in positions of authority to navigate the research, to navigate what research is actually good research? Because it's not their job to know how to read research. So we need educators who are able to actually filter through the research, see what is being done well and what is perhaps not being done so well.
Yeah, and I think that what drives, that's exactly what drives many of us who are educators and who are, learning about our own neurologies. That's where it ties into finding community, right? But again, my brain is like actually just going everywhere right now.
You fit right in. You fit right in.
Yeah, well, and really the whole premise of where do we go now and how do we bridge this huge divide, this huge gap in understanding, because we have, many autistics around the world, particularly, since the greater understanding of neurodiversity has come into existence. But again, we're still just scratching the surface. So I think many of us have come together over the last 20, 15, 10, and especially during the last, I'd say 3 to 5 years, really, really exploring a lot of these pieces. So the gap in knowledge in terms of the who decides what's happening in education from the top down. And that includes politicians too, right? And I think that's what people forget is oftentimes we have great people in upper level management, in school leadership positions, et cetera, across many boards in boards of education, not just in Canada, but around the world. But they're bound by regulations and statutes, et cetera, et cetera. What's so interesting is that if those people collaboratively start to unpack things like the CRPD Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we're talking a lot about human rights in schools. Certainly in Ontario, most boards of education have human rights policies and procedures now in place. And they're trying to really unroll what does that look like in practice. But the problem is, even when those pieces of paper get drafted and finalized, and there's a lot of consultation that goes on, a lot of really important conversations, it's what happens next that's important. And so I think what we're seeing in education is that, as much as we'd love to say, let's change policies and practice, policies and, legislation, et cetera, a lot of those things take a very long time. It doesn't mean we're going to give that up, because obviously change will come, but we have to keep that fight kind of going. But simultaneously, it's a multi-pronged approach, because we have families who are connecting with neurodivergent educators. They're seeing the impact of neurodivergent educators on their neurodivergent children, because again, they're finding, wow, there's neurodivergent people that are adults that are resonating with my child, and my child resonated with them. And they're learning that a lot of, if not most of, the old ways of doing things in education have been decided from the outside in, from that external narrative of what it is to be autistic. And so there's a lot of conflicting messages that come at educators, and that's where the role of the neurodivergent educators are so important, because if we're living this, life as an educator or a school leader, and our ideas, our lived experience can inform where we try to go, the ways we're innovating, different things like that. And then when we connect with each other and with students and families who are neurodivergent, that's where the real amazing stuff is happening, right in the classroom, in organic ways, right? Like one of the things that we do is something called the AUsome Human Club, and it's been amazing.
Love that.
Yeah, AUsome, right? And when we did it last year, it was something that I actually brought in friends from around the world who are also autistic, because again, having found different people all around the world, and understanding some of our lived experiences, the intersectionality, the crisscross of experiences, the barriers, the obstacles, just so much when you find each other and you can start to compare notes and say, oh, like I thought it was just me. And it's funny how many times people will say that, even in social media, it comes up a lot. But we would, so I would invite obviously members of the Neurodivergent Infinity Network of Educators, those who are autistic, as well as our international colleagues come in, and we would have virtual, hangouts essentially, with little humans, and in some cases their families would join. And, the feedback from the kids, from the families, was just phenomenal. And that has really led us to, wonder how much is really needed of this, because we knew it was important for these mentor-mentee coaching kind of, community affinity spaces. But like when you have 6 and 7-year-olds, just when I'm talking of last year's pilot, 6 and 7-year-olds who are saying, I'm autistic too, and they're excited about it.
Exactly.
That's huge, right?
Those are my favorite moments.
Yeah.
I love that.
Right. And I mean, just helping the kids and the adults, because let me tell you, it was just as beneficial for us as it was for them. It was our bucket filling time. It was huge. It was amazing. Like I remember when we set it up, it was kind of, like I said, organic, and the conversations would be about, different specializations. And so one little person I remember he shared something about the London Underground, and that led to us talking about different vehicles. And then there was somebody who was really into bridges and structures. And so, Maddie, a friend of mine who goes by Existential Autist and worked very closely with me on the Intersectional Infinity Summit, he was there that day. And I remember he was showing us pictures of his local bridges over in the UK, which was really cool. So it was all these very organic moments, but it allowed for that authentic use of preferred and natural forms of communication. So we had speakers and non-speakers and multimodal communicators and situationally mute folks. And we were normalizing that because it was space, right? And I mean, fast forward to this year, it's a little later than I had wanted to roll it out, but sometimes there's other things that come up, and we've been really experimenting with a lot of intentionally focused like neurodiversity education in the classroom amongst a number of classes. So that's been kind of I'm on a tangent. That's been kind of a little bit of a distraction, but it's been a powerful and useful distraction, because what's come out of those in-class visits is now, as we're getting ready to start up the AUsome Human Club in a different way. I'm now with grade K to 8, so kindergarten to grade 8 students. Kids from all grades are sharing their lived experiences and asking about, can they join? And like, they really want to understand more. And we've got kids that are seeking to be allies who are saying, I want to join the AUsome Human Club. So there's so much that I think we're just scratching the surface on the impact of finding community. Yes. And that's right where now we have this opportunity to start it with young humans who can start exploring their own neurotypes in more intentional ways, right? Yeah.
No, exactly. I think actually, making communities available to young children is extremely valuable, also because of the frankly developmental benefits of having community. You're so much more vulnerable to anxiety and depression if you don't have community.
Even one friend is a protective factor against anxiety, depression, all of those things.
It is. And having that and meeting people who are like you can be healing, honestly. I think one of the things that we've done terribly in Denmark is back in 2012, we had a major school reform. And one of the things that happened was this was actually a cost-saving exercise, but of course they tried to brand it as inclusion.
Of course.
So what they did was actually they shut down a whole bunch of we call them special schools. I don't know if that's the same. So we have special schools, and then we have treatment schools, which are kind of the level above special schools, because special schools is not like there isn't treatment personnel there. So like for kids who have gone through burnout, or who actually need, for example, a therapist, things like that, right? So they closed down a whole bunch of special schools, and they put as many kids into the regular school programs as they could, but they didn't transfer the funds, and they didn't educate teachers or any staff on how to cope with this. And of course, what happened was all of a sudden you had classes of, 35 kids where maybe 3 or 4 of them were neurodivergent in some way. And the
sounds like the everyday reality in Ontario education.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it's reality in a lot of places, but the fact is, it's been detrimental to everyone's mental health. It's been detrimental to the teachers. It's been detrimental to neurotypical kids. We've seen like rates of burnout and school refusal in even neurotypical children skyrocket. But also neurodivergent kids, I think they lost access to so many other kids who were different, and they lost access to an environment where it was okay and where it was normal. And I don't know. I think they lost some community when that happened, because going from being in a school that is for kids who have, I'm going to say special needs, but it's not special needs, right? It's just
different ways of being and experiencing the world. Yeah.
But going from that to now you just have to go to a regular elementary school
and fit into the box.
Yeah.
Well, and that's I think that's the piece right there, is there's not been a setup for success.
No.
Right. You can't flip a switch and cut funding. I mean, even though programs are flawed, we get that. We know there's, even in specialized settings, et cetera, just the fact that so many things that are set up for autistics are called treatment,
is ABA based. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. I think the problem is that we can't remove one without setting the other up for success. And so that's where planting these seeds and cross ideas and teachers living and breathing and unlearning with neurodivergent fellow educators. And what's fascinating too is we talk about finding community. I can't tell you the number of educators who did not know that they were neurodivergent until we started doing like in October, in our area, we, there's lots of things happening in October. There's like ADHD awareness, autism awareness, all these things, AAC awareness, LD awareness in October. So it's a big month. And we're really not a fan of, that whole awareness piece, right? In the advocacy world and in terms of humanizing education. So in October, 9 proposed to all the 8 municipalities in our region, let's rebrand this. Let's acknowledge that this is Neurodiversity Education and Neurodivergent Awareness Month. And so like a little campaign, and they were all successful, which was really exciting. So step, right? Because that led to conversations with mayors and people in different municipalities and conversations opening. But in that context, one of the things that we created was a slide deck that was shared with schools, and it's available on our website as well, but it was shared. And so many staff were using these, whether online or in person, to open dialogue with their classes. And I can't tell you, even just as recent as I think Friday, and again, this is now, April, people are accessing these slides to help them introduce because they need to learn too, right? This was not taught. If there's a paragraph on neurodiversity in teacher practice, in teacher programs and teacher education programs, we're paragraph, right? And it's often the medical model. It's often here are the conditions, here are the disorders, here are the things you need to look for, essentially framing up, anybody who's neurodivergent as broken, right? Which is unfortunate. Educators, if they don't know that that's not the current reality, that's not what the research is saying in terms of natural neurodiversity.
Or that it can even be framed in a different way. They need exposure to this.
Totally.
That's why I love teaching in the education faculty, because my whole course is about that. My whole course is learning tools are for everyone. What works for your brain? You can do this in your classroom too,
Yeah. And that's where it's so powerful, because that's where the ideas, when we have co-op students or when we have teacher candidates being hosted in classrooms, how powerful is it for them to have exposure to, this learning that is being done alongside the students, alongside their teacher partners. But the point I was going to make, so just so I can wrap the point, is that teachers experiencing these announcements, these very basic intro slides, right? Like about stimming and about hypo and hypersensitivity and the sensory, they're reaching out, some of them immediately and then some more recently. And they're like, Karen, I had no idea that that wasn't how everybody experienced the world. Like what you've described, what Nine has shared, or what that video from Autistic said, like those things, that's what I'm living and breathing. And like maybe I need to come to join Nine. Like I need to understand. And so it's really fascinating, because what's happening is teachers are then exploring their neurotype while their students are co-learning about different neurotypes and the idea of neurodiversity. And even those who would not necessarily identify as neurodivergent are really coming along and saying, like, we have to do something. This okay, even if I'm not neurodivergent, my friend is neurodivergent, right? And I didn't know that this was their experience. I mean, I knew they had autism or they had this or that, but it's important. I need to do better as a friend. And so a lot of leadership is happening, again, very organically, not from necessarily top down, because, there's a lot of legwork that has to happen to get changes made, but in the classrooms. And so a lot of times that's where I think the magic is happening, and we're highlighting those successes. And, when those things are happening, that's the data, right? Because teachers are coming forward and embracing, kids are coming forward, embracing, and time again, whether it's from parent guardians, from other schools who have teachers that are doing this now because they were doing it with us, or students, you're seeing this resounding, oh my gosh, like when we talk about this child comes alive. This child now suddenly contributing and collaborating. That child didn't feel like they had a voice, and now they're talking, or they're, using other ways of talking, and they're really showing, how amazing they are, which often teachers know their kids are amazing.
Yeah.
They don't know how to reach them, because what they're trying to do is have the child reach them in their way. But really, educators need to be learning the language of the children. And when the teachers don't know what their neurotypes are, there's often a lot of really collaborative learning and unlearning that has to happen, right? So that's the data we have to be using. And that's where we're going to make changes, because that's where parents and guardians are seeing it too. Right.
When they see the confidence build and coming home feeling like, I found my people. I have friends now. I have people who understand me. I see that all the time in my classroom, because it's a small setting. They're all autistic. We talk about being autistic. I share about myself being autistic. And it's really magical to see when the narrative shifts for them as well, because often what they've been told about autism is like, it's a grand tragedy, or they've been bullied for being autistic. And then they're finally coming to see, like, look at all these people that I love around me who know so much about the world, who, I have great rapport with. Our conversations, there's never a communication breakdown with us, really, in that classroom, and knowing that is possible and that they have something to offer to others, to one another. I feel like so much of the work we have to do is, like you said, multi-pronged. We have to help educate families and adults, but we also have to give children a vision of what is possible.
Absolutely. I think, it reminds me of, again, thinking of like the idea of finding community. It reminds me back to when, I actually pursued a formal diagnosis, because many of us have been later diagnosed. Just because of, the barriers to diagnosis and the obviously outdated,
diagnostic criteria. Yeah.
The whole, was based on a bunch of little white boys kind of thing. So there's so many layers to that, right? But I remember being, I was already a school administrator several years in, and but I had also always had a way of connecting with many kids, but certainly those who are neurodivergent, some of the ones that a lot of other people found very hard to reach, right? And that included like non-speakers. It included kids who were seen historically as like behavior problems, in the mainstream, but also in small classes, et cetera. And it was no magic powers. It was just, there was some different, it was like an intuitive understanding. It doesn't mean that I was doing the things the way I would do them now that I know what I know. And we're always learning and having to unpack that. Like I have the notion that we're all complicit in education. It holds true for neurodivergent educators too, because we're part of systems that are innately oppressive and based on capitalism and industrial model. And, we can't blame people that are in power necessarily for where we're at right now, but it's where do we go next, right? And I always think back to sitting on the floor in the hallway by like the CERT office, which here in Ontario is the Special Education Resource Teacher's Office, and connecting with at least 3 girls at different times who, they were really struggling. They were, having a lot of times where they weren't able to stay in the class. They were feeling completely misunderstood. They like literally despised being in their classrooms. They felt bullied. They were bullied, sensory stuff, but also things like, not feeling able to communicate with mouth words when they had to. And so luckily I had a great team of very reflective folks in the, in terms of my CERT team and what have you. And they continued to unlearn and try new things. But for me, those moments sitting beside those different girls, and I was able to say to them, it's kind of like I was describing their experience and saying, I remember that, right? Like not so that it was about me, but so that they knew that I understood. And the kids often like turn to me and say, yeah, how did you know that? Because like nobody had ever described it to them that way. And so I give credit. I mean, yeah, I've got tons of years of experience, but I give credit to those conversations for helping me on my journey too. And that was after being, like I said, an administrator. I specialized in special education, which I don't even like that term anymore, right? But that's always been my passion. But, I think, and also there was some articles that were being read, right? So while we were digging deeper to understand how do we support these girls, I remember reading an article, and again, a different way of finding community. The article, I can't remember where it was or what it was called. It was actually a hard paper magazine copy, believe it or not. I don't even know why. And it had to do with, I think it said, it all made sense. It you know what I mean? Something like that was in the, you can probably find it, but and when I read it subsequent to there, like there's still medical model language and stuff like that. But I remember reading that article in the context of trying to figure out how do we support these girls. And it turned out that the 3 that I'm thinking of all received new diagnoses back at the time. And this was only about I don't know, 6, 7 years ago at the most.
Mm.
And this article, I remember sitting there reading it and crying because I was like, wow, like all the, you have, what do we call them? Retro epiphanies.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
Right. Yeah. I don't take credit for coining it. I heard it somewhere in social media, but I loved it. Retro epiphanies is such a, reading that article, it featured several different autistic women. And then they were successful. They were doing different jobs. They had different interests. Like it was a fairly diverse group for a small sample, but they were telling their stories, and it was fascinating to me because I thought, oh, that's totally exactly what I have experienced, right? Like in some cases, they were like literally down to similar conversations or things they had been told, job interview experiences, right? Stuff like related to camouflage, what we now call masking, and all of those, eye contact, all of those things that, eye contact's a big one for me because that was one of the biggest indicators for me when I was growing up. There's other things as I think back, but that article, connecting with those kids, and, eye contact has just been something for me that was always sort of this, like, why does it feel so heebie-jeebies to me?
Exactly.
I thought, I just thought that this was something that I really sucked at, really, is how so it was like, what's wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
You internalize age. Why can't you do that? And to this day, we're still fighting the fight to help people understand why, no, eye contact is not a prerequisite to active, interactive, listening.
Yeah.
Because many people use eye contact and we think they need eye contact, there's a heck of a lot more out there that don't actually need it and find it actually more overstimulating, or culturally irresponsible, right?
Yes.
Because
variety of reasons.
As you're talking, I can't help but think about how a lot of the people who get a late diagnosis, it's kind of getting blindsided and like having to reframe the whole way that you think about yourself.
Yeah.
Suddenly in adulthood. And then what happens for me is like, okay, now you have this diagnosis, and we come to our diagnoses in different ways. I was diagnosed at 16, which is still kind of a late diagnosis, but in terms of many of the people I meet, I was fairly early diagnosed. And people kind of discover it in very different ways. But then they're sat there thinking, okay, where do I go from here? And how do I find the people I actually relate to? Because they're still stuck in very often a very neurotypical world, or they're stuck in having been masking their whole lives and not knowing how to unmask and relate to their own autistic, authentic selves, which in some ways is kind of a key to being able to go out and find other autistic people and become happy about your own autism.
Well, community is such a conduit for self-understanding
and self-acceptance,
right? I remember seeing someone on Twitter said something like, it's such a relief to know that you are, a zebra and not like a broken horse or something like that. And it's so appropriate. And I think it's through our exposure, through our interactions that feel so much more comfortable with other neurodivergent people, that those of us who are late diagnosed, like we start to go, oh, that's you too. I thought it was just me. Oh, and that becomes like our list of, oh my gosh, this is a trait that I have. Oh, this is something that I've experienced. And I feel terrible for people who don't have community or haven't figured out how to access community. Do you have any tips for that, Karen? Like how how can people find their people?
Yeah, well, and I think before we even think about how we find our people, I think we have to also really, as a whole global autistic community, really put pressure on ourselves. Not that we don't have enough pressure already, but I think we really have to focus our efforts on finding common ground, but also amplifying the perspectives and the voices and the lived experiences of those who are historically most marginalized within the autistic community. And, because here we have 3 white presenting female folks, and, just that alone is huge privilege, right? And my experiences are obviously not the same as either of yours, but the more degrees of different lenses of identity, we really have to unpack that the experiences that I speak to, I can't assume that those are similar for other folks. I mean, when we think of identify as Black or Indigenous people of color, or if they prefer global members of the global majority, the need to code switch in different communities, whether it be workplace or home, is certainly has been not, I don't want to say parallel, but it's been compared to the idea of autistic masking. So if you're an autistic who's also a member of the global majority, you've got extra layers there, and you can't turn them off and on, because you are always an autistic person, and you are always a person of color, or a presenting person of color, right? And so I think, the conversations that we're having have to be done through an intersectional understanding, have to be done through a real trauma-informed lens. That's why research has to continually include diverse autistic voices when it's about autistic perspectives. But I think there has to be also a concerted effort for groups, for example, like Autistics Unmasked, who started up, I want to say just a couple of years ago in the States. And, their focus is on, bridge building, connecting, amplifying perspectives from the members of the global majority who are autistic. And not to mention amplifying those who are non-speakers, or let's say folks who have what we would consider higher support needs, because we know support needs fluctuate and we're not looking at functioning levels. So, but in terms of opportunities, I think what we're doing in Nine is, it is kind of modeling some of those things. So the reach outs, the opportunities for families to connect with other families of autistics, when we challenge or provide feedback to organizations at the provincial or national or international level, I see so-and-so is doing a great job of amplifying autistic perspectives in their work. I wonder, be collaborative ways that autistics could be brought into the dialogue, because I think one of the biggest obstacles to people finding community is actually the organizations who are there to support the autistic community. And I don't feel that it's always intent. I think sometimes there are, again, those policies, those funding obstacles, we can't take a stand against X, Y, or Z, because if we do, that means we're not going to get certain funding, right? Yes. By not taking a stand, you perpetuate power imbalances, you perpetuate old ways of doing things. But if you think about it, that pipeline of, I have a child, my child is diagnosed, the first place you go, even before the diagnosis, is to a doctor, to a organization that has, the word autism in it. whether that's, that has the country or provinces or states name in it or not. And by and large, those are still organized by non-autistics.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think we have to help educators, but also the medical profession learn from autistics. So those have to be part of the recommendations. A progressive doctor is saying, listen, here are my recommendations. Let's hope they're going to say things like, let's try for OT to work on, movement, motor things.
Sensory,
or what.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The language, maybe, because we're not going to have your child forced to be using mouth words, but rather, what form of communication meets their needs best and allows them to be their authentic self. So we're hoping for those sorts of moves, sort of against the compliance-based recommendations that frequently are the defaults, because let's face it, many doctors, they know how to do a diagnosis, but they don't actually have any lived experience or updated training related to the amazing amount of research that is now out there that shows us, the reality of things like monotropism and the reality of how stimming is essential and should not be curbed. Especially.
And of course, part of that is also that frankly, ABA has been so successful in branding itself as the way.
I talked to a professional last month who was being like, I've seen like some amazing outcomes. This child at ABA in kindergarten, you should have seen them in grade 6. I said, why do we always attribute success and growth over time to that? Like they are now 6 years older. That success is because of many things, themselves, their maturity. Why do we always attribute it? Like, I was like, we need to not think that way.
and who's defining that success?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Huge part.
And by which measurements?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is
well, I think that's exactly the thing is we call it the industrial complex, the autism industrial complex, for a reason, right? I mean, it literally is this mechanical creature that has continually kind of adapted, right? Because there's a way of working with students, with children, within the context of what those practitioners do. And the children, families, if they didn't believe in it, like the families for sure, if they didn't believe in it, if doctors didn't think that was the best way to do it, then hopefully they wouldn't, recommend it. Right.
Then they would recommend something else.
Right. But the problem is, if a child is being trained to curb their natural ways of being and they're getting reinforced for doing that, then they're getting told that what they're doing by masking their authentic self in many ways is the good thing to do. They're basically being reinforced, with the idea that the way they were doing it is the broken way. Mm-hmm. So now do right. So I mean, if a child is seeing their family, again, who wants what's best for their child, but their family is so excited because they're now doing this, or they're keeping their hands and feet still, or they're only using mouth words, and whatever the thing is that they're working on, I think it's so heartbreaking, because so many of these kids and families are defining success, but it's actually the success of masking.
Yeah, by appealing to other people and what they want.
Right.
And the thing is,
exactly. And that's the thing. What people don't realize is masking is not something that we say, I'm going to wake up and I'm not going to look autistic today. That's not what it is. And I attribute a substantial amount of my learning about masking and burnout, as well as a lot of other pieces, to my training with Karen Rose, which I always like to plug, the Autistic Advocate. And the whole idea of masking is often not an intentional thing we do. It has literally conditioned into us from the time we are infants, because everything that's reinforced, everything that is seen as normal, typical, developmentally appropriate behavior, etc., is positively reinforced, because, parents, guardians, doctors are looking at these milestones, these checklists of what's normal, right?
Mm-hmm.
If a child is making eye gaze, even if it doesn't feel right to them, the second they make eye contact, the family is like, "Oh, look, it's so cute."
Yeah.
That learning, that's a reward, right? And so that's why when we liken things like ABA to compliance-based, dog training, and I don't like to say it, but it's true, because we're trying to, when we use that method, we're trying to use, have that child put their needs, their authentic ways of being, behind the needs of those around them.
Yes.
And I know that the intent is for the child to adapt, for the child to fit in more, for them to be successful. But really, what has to be happening is, if we put the energy into shifting thinking generally, and kids can be stimming, it is changing. But when we go into classrooms and there's still posters on the wall that say hands and feet still, if you're an autistic, it doesn't matter how old you are, because there's many autistics, non-speaking and otherwise, who could be reading that way before you even realize they can read that poster. And every day they go in, they are curbing stimming. Yeah. They're spending inordinate amounts of energy, preventing themselves from, or they're imploding. And meltdowns, or eloping, because they're literally in this heightened state of exhaustion and trauma. And
very true, very true. And I think a lot of people would probably have less of a positive view of ABA if they knew where it comes from, if they knew that it actually shares roots with and uses the same principles as gay conversion therapy,
which was deemed unethical, and then somehow they're allowed to do it with little autistic children.
Yeah, and I think if people actually realized that, they perhaps would
think twice about it.
Yeah. Now we've actually gotten to the point now where I think we should bring in thing of the day.
Sure.
So I actually, we talked briefly about what should be the thing of the day for this. And I thought, well, let's bring in some of the online communities that exist. And I immediately thought of what was one of the first things I found back when, well, not when I was diagnosed, but a couple of years after, because it took me a couple of years to even really be ready to investigate it. And back then, what existed was the website wrongplanet.net.
Oh.
And that actually still exists. Now, I haven't been on it for a really long time, so I don't know how it's really evolved, but I can see that they now also have discussion forums for other neurodiverse conditions. So it's certainly evolving, and people are still posting, so it's still a real forum. But wrongplanet.net was founded by Alex Plank, who is an autistic advocate.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And he's great. I met him one time, like way back. Yeah. But he's great. And we were talking, and one of the things that made him really want a forum like this is, first of all, he always kind of felt like he was an alien, right? Mm-hmm. And he wanted to create a place where autistics could go and talk to other people who were also autistic, and have that safe space and be able to hear autistic voices and discuss things from an autistic perspective. And of course, now with social media, that has become like so much bigger. There's now Facebook groups. There's certainly communities on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and everything. We're everywhere. But I think there's something really wonderful about how the online autistic communities actually allow autistic people from all over the world, even in countries where it's even more stigmatized than it is in the Western world. It allows them to find other autistic voices and to have that sense of community, even if it is at a distance.
Mm-hmm. One of the plus sides of the internet, I suppose, is being able to connect, and how isolating it would be without the ability to reach out to people wherever they may be, to find those connections.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, aside from, in-person local settings in our workplaces or what have you, most of the collaborative, events, collaborative planning, groundbreaking work that's happening is, internationally through these collaborations, right? And when I think back to my beginning, my understanding of, like I said, I read that article and I was like, I need to find out more. And one of my first exploratory journeys, the rabbit hole, I guess, I came across who's now known as Lyric Holman's Neurodivergent Rebel. And I just thought, this is what autism looks like. That whole, because there is no look to being. And so that Lyric, their fresh perspective, they're like, I'm out here. I want you to know, like, this is my journey. This is where I'm at. I'm not an expert, but like, holy cow, like we have to start understanding things. And so like challenging people to just, and so they put themselves out there. And there were many simultaneously kind of doing that. But I think Lyric's work was really quite groundbreaking in a lot of ways. And I've said this to them as well, because I've had the pleasure and honor of collaborating with them and invited them to the Intersectional Infinity Summit. And I think relationships are forever, right? So once you're connected, you're only a DM away, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's so magical, I think, about these things. But we're all exploring and trying to understand, at the same time trying to bring about change, but simultaneously trying to keep in our mind, we've got to heal from traumas and we've got to take care of ourselves. And then we've got this monitoring, amazing ability to really like work through, analyze, like specialize in these things that are of interest to us. And for many of us, it's things like social justice and equity and advocacy. We may remember doing this even when we were little kids, but we weren't doing it for ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, for me, when I came across Lyric's work, that just led to more and more digging deeper, right? And I think that's where, and I'm not here to plug the summit, but I just like, I was really so pleased with how the power of community put that together, because it was literally one conversation, another conversation, another conversation. Like, I mean, I remember when it first came to me and I thought, and this is what happens, right? When you're an outside of the box thinker, I wonder if I just, reach out to Marenike Giwa Anaiwu, who did this amazing, TEDx talk. And, I wonder, and, you reach out and you get a response and you're like, oh, wow. And then you get into that conversation. I remember sitting there in the Zoom meeting, like crying with her and saying, you can't fathom how unbelievably powerful this is for me to be sitting here conversing with somebody who, like, I saw, who again was so influential in me understanding even that concept of normalizing stimming, that drive in me to recognize, here's a beautiful Black autistic person. Their journey is not my journey. Mm-hmm. And this was part of my call to action as well. But I remember approaching them and talking about this. We had this great conversation. And then lo and behold, like, there was Morenike at the summit, doing their thing. And, so many people came together for this common goal. And that's why I think when we talk about finding community, we have the power to bring this web of amazing people out there, diverse perspectives, faith, gender identities, differing support needs, different types of communication. Many people have been presumed incompetent, yet they're gifted in so many ways. And those that have a variety of coexisting other neurological differences, folks who identify as also deaf or also blind, so like the intersectionality and bringing this together to broaden the narrative, like, so pivotal. And when we introduce those resources, when we create more books, when we share podcasts or do these collaborative events and share them, we're creating a new resource bank, right?
And seeing too how huge our community is. We truly are not alone. We truly are interconnected. We can learn from one another, the experiences that we have in common, the things that are different about each of us. And I think that that is so central to having an autistic identity that feels secure, that feels positive. Obviously there are things that are very hard for us, and that's okay. That's okay. But we also have this wonderful community, and we have things that we can use as strengths. We can find workarounds for, and we can rely on one another.
Yeah. I think it's never going to be not a handicap for me, in some ways, but in other ways, it's just a part of who I am and just a part of how I relate to the world. And for that reason, it's also a part of choosing, obviously not consciously, but it's a part of choosing which communities I want to be a part of and which people I relate to. And there's something beautiful in how different we all are, yet how similar.
Yeah.
And how well we connect across cultures, across languages, across everything. Kara, I don't know if you've thought up a question yet, but it is time.
Okay, on the spot. All right, Karen, I would love to know, when you were a child or a teenager, if you could have created any club around like a special interest or passion to find your people, what would it have been?
Gosh. It's a hard question because, so it's interesting because I absolutely recognize my monotropic neurology, but I'm one of those people who, like, some of us have this thing that is like long lasting for their entire life. That's their thing.
We just talked about this. We just recorded another episode on like interest jumping a little bit. Yeah.
For me, and again, like I had a previous diagnosis of also ADHD, but again, there's problems with that criteria as well. And I think a lot of the ADHD type stuff is or because of autistic masking and extensive amounts of energy. So I don't deny that diagnosis because it exists, what have you, but it's also, it's all part of a social construct. So with that in mind, I think because of how my brain is, I am more of an interest jumper. It doesn't mean that there's not themes to those interests. Where I have found the most drive is definitely related to like social justice, definitely related to, I mean, I can even remember when I was very young, you know, and I mean, when you're little, you don't know like where are you supposed to, how are you supposed, we didn't talk about the word ally or anything, but I remember being in like grade 1 or something. And I didn't like the fact that one of my friends was being forced to say the word God when they were not in the national. No, so it was the Lord's Prayer. It was the Lord, because we still back in Ontario, we had to do the Lord's Prayer. Fundamentally, for me, that was like, well, why are we doing this? But you know, where I stood ground was I didn't want my friend who was not a Christian, or I don't even remember who the person was or their faith. I just remember thinking, that's not fair. Why should they have to do this prayer? You know. And then thankfully they removed it from, not because of me, I don't take credit for that, but I remember sense of relief, right? You know, so I think things related to social justice. At one point I was definitely a huge like environmental kind of person. And it's not to say that that's gone, but I think more in terms of how do we leave the world better than when we arrived into it, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes people will say, well, like you do your work and you try to enjoy life, and I get it, and that's important, and I love my hobbies and things like that because they're what keep you well, and we have to really work at that sometimes, right? Like giving ourselves permission to
yes.
Right? Yeah. Because I mean, I literally try not to ABA myself, you know, because of thinking, oh, I've been at this for X amount of hours. I really need to stop it. But it's because I want to make sure I still have a family. And because there are, you know, like this morning, I started going to yoga again, like a couple weeks back, and I had missed that. But like, I'm not a sit in front of the TV and do it. Like I need to structure it, schedule it, and then have to send the text message a half hour before to say I'm coming, because then I'm committed, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think social justice, equity, definitely.
You know, I actually think that the point you made about how do we leave the world a better place applies to so many different interests. It definitely is not just about environment. It's also about policy. It's also about social justice. It's about everything. And I think, if we all keep in mind, how do we make a positive impression on the world? How do we leave something, better?
And also know it's not all on our shoulders, because that has been a heavy burden for me. It definitely contributed to my burnout. And eventually I realized, no, I'm one of many planting seeds. And there are times like I can pass the mantle to you, or, you know, I can take a breath. I can take time to care for myself, as well as engaging in the work and the passion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's so many, we can burn out very easily, not because we're not strong and powerful and amazing, but because we're expending so much to just fit into this society that wasn't built for us, that weren't designed for us. We're redefining what the workplace looks like. There's these barriers and biases against us that say like we lack empathy, or, you know, and so
the personal layer is really difficult, which is why the importance of community is such a like such a thing to celebrate, because we need one another to do the work too.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to end, actually, today. I think we've managed to only go about 10 minutes over time this time. Yay,
Great.
us.
We sometimes are worse at this, so that's
good. I think we've done well. I also think that we could probably keep going for
we could cover so many
3 or 4 hours.
I know. Well, there's always other opportunities.
Yeah.
One thing, if I may, and this is not a moneymaker. This is literally just so that as an extension of the Intersectional Infinity Summit, we do have a whole bunch of people are contributing stories to an anthology that I've been compiling and working with. Kara's contributed, and people all around the world. So this anthology is going to be coming out, and it literally is called Finding Community. So I didn't want to leave Finding Community before saying that, because that, like, changing the narrative means the stories need to get out there.
Yes.
And this is another great way. And we're not the only ones doing it, right? Like there's been a huge, just a lot of groundbreaking work that's being done. A lot of narratives are being published, and picture books and things like that, because the representation is just not there. So it's growing and changing, and that's a huge piece of Finding Community, right? So
absolutely
find stories in there that resonate with them.
I can't wait for that to come out. It's going to be a great collection of musings and writings and insights from all sorts of autistic folks on finding community, for better, for worse, everything in between. Yeah.
I love it. Well,
I look forward to reading that.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's it, folks. We'll see you another time. Follow us on social media and let us know what else you want to hear about from us.
Yeah. So you can find me at Maya Todale or at An Autistic Psychologist. And you can find Kara at
Dr. Kara Diamond.
And you can find Karen Timm.
I'm on Twitter at Karen Ann Timm, and also for 9 at 9_ON_CAN.
And we'll post that in the show notes.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you next time.
Thank you.
Autistic tidbits and tangents.